think we're pretty good for, a tenth of the market cap of Ethereum to have half as decentralized. Like that's not bad. Like if you think Ethereum today is sufficiently decentralized, you should be pretty comfortable with Solana. If you don't think Ethereum is sufficiently decentralized, then you're not going to think Solana is sufficiently decentralized either. One of the great things about Firedancer is it's squeezing more performance out of the same hardware. Yeah, it's funny because when it happens on Solana, people are mercenary, and when it happens on Ethereum, it's just value accrual, right? So there's a little bit of hypocrisy in some of those criticisms. Like we all remember Friendtech, right? There is almost no network that could have gone through what Solana went through and come out as strong as it's come out on this side.
Hello l'équipe, j'espère que vous allez bien. Aujourd'hui on se retrouve pour une nouvelle interview. Cette fois-ci j'ai le plaisir de recevoir Austin de la fondation Solana qui donc s'occupe de toute la stratégie de Solana et qui avant s'occupait de toute la communication de Solana. C'est quelqu'un qui est très très proche des fondateurs, à savoir Anatoly et Raj. Et en plus d'être proche d'eux, il est surtout proche de tout l'écosystème, donc notamment tous les builders, les médias, les VC, les législateurs, enfin bref, avec tout le monde. Donc ça lui permet vraiment d'avoir une vision 360 de l'écosystème et surtout de comprendre l'écosystème de bout en bout, que ce soit techniquement ou même en termes de produits. Donc j'espère que cette interview vous plaira. N'hésitez pas à mettre un petit like, à vous abonner si ce n'est pas déjà fait et on commence tout de suite. Hello Austin, can you hear me?
Bonsoir.
How is it going?
Good. How are you?
I mean, I can't complain with the market. Lately, we've seen some growth, I would say, in the market, especially also on Solana. So I think it will be one of the topics of this interview. Is it your first appearance, like in a French-speaking media, or?
I've done the last 2 years of Paris Blockchain Week. So There's been a few times where I've talked to some journalists in France, but not too often. So it's nice to be here today with you.
I think it will be a great opportunity to speak to the French community. I think there is like a lot of Solana fans in the French-speaking community, but also a lot of skeptical people. So I think that might be an opportunity maybe to convince them, or at least to consider what's going on Solana. Maybe to introduce a bit this interview, could you introduce yourself, what you're doing, what you love? Yeah, what you're doing in the ecosystem, basically.
Yeah, certainly. So I am the head of strategy for the Solana Foundation, and I've been involved with the Solana community for coming up on 3 years at this point. I joined the network it's a long time, yeah. In January of 2021, working for Solana Labs on comms and marketing and product for them. And then I moved over to work for the foundation in June of 2022. And, a lot of my work really focuses on like the network level, which is sort of what technologies are we sort of thinking about building out, what grant classifications are we going to be looking at giving grants for to support, advancement and adoption of the Solana blockchain, and then a lot of work just on sort of how do we support communities and products and, projects building on the Solana network.
So I think this is pretty interesting because like you're kind of like in the heart of the ecosystem because like basically you talk to everybody and I think you can basically understand what's relevant, what's not, what's like is promising and what is probably a bit less. And maybe one question before we dive into Solana and all these topics, like what were you doing before Solana? Because you mentioned that you started working with Solana 3 years ago. Were you into crypto before that? Or were you doing like some very different types of things not related to crypto?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back far enough, coming out of college in 2013, I was, I did political science and environmental science undergraduate, and so a lot of that work was on compliance frameworks in international freshwater management treaties, like very nerdy stuff. But like in retrospect, like not actually that dissimilar from blockchain governance and a lot of how these things work. Basically, like how do you get two countries or two different parties who are either, in a conflict zone or have had several wars with each other to agree on framework management treaties for, collective management of natural resources, in this case, water. I love that stuff. I'm still kind of a huge policy nerd when it comes to how that stuff all fits together. I thought about going down the route and getting a PhD and actually like making that kind of my life and career. But there was something about it that felt like the impact maybe wasn't quite there. I think I was on the NBER website, which is the National Bureau of Economic Relations. They post all the papers there, and it was something like the average article had, I think, 7 downloads on it, and the average paper had 5 authors.
Okay.
So not even everyone's mom was reading it, right? And so that's like the state of like a lot of this stuff. And so I actually spent a few years working as a journalist for National Public Radio and then the Boston Globe and Public Radio International before getting into startups. And then I found myself getting into crypto accidentally. In mid 2017, I was working for a fintech company in New York City here. And they were in the process of failing and in the process of trying to pivot to build what we would now call a DeFi protocol. But then it was just the idea of building a borrow lend token on Ethereum. And
Very
I
early.
well, it depends. I'd messed around with Bitcoin like back in the day, but like it didn't really catch me. This idea of like, oh, we have digital gold. I was like, that's cool, but like that's not intellectually interesting to me. That's just like,
There's more to do.
yeah, right. Like there's got to be more here. And I sort of had missed the initial news about Ethereum largely because it was all theoretical and all hypothetical and, you know, it was all vaporware back in the day. But by the time you get around to 2017, like you could actually build smart contracts on Ethereum and like this was a real platform. And so having to sit down and learn it for work, I got bit by the bug. That company I was working for never went anywhere, never really was successful at all, and they shut down a few months later. But that really like got me interested in this space, and I wanted to, you know, dedicate a significant chunk of my career to working in this technology. And so I went to work for Republic and launched Republic Crypto with them, and then joined a few stealth blockchain companies before landing at Bison Trails, which was a blockchain infrastructure company that got acquired by Coinbase and became Coinbase Cloud. But I was working on product marketing for them and sort of the whole launch of their platform product up until their acquisition by Coinbase, which is then when I joined the Solana ecosystem. So one of the nice things about kind of working at Bison Trails is I had a really broad-based exposure to the 30 plus different protocols and networks that Coinbase was supporting the launch of back in the day, or that Bison Trails was supporting the launches of back in the day. So that was a really awesome place to be in 2020 and sort of sitting in an overview of pretty much everything going on in the blockchain ecosystem.
And so how did you get convinced in a way to work at Solana? Were you convinced by, I don't know, Anatoly or Raj or like any people in the team? Or was it more like just you fall in love with a specific part and just applied? Or like, how did it work?
So in probably the 6 months leading up to me joining the Solana ecosystem, I'd been working on ETH2 staking infrastructure. This was kind of our biggest product rollout at Bison Trails. We, at that point, ran over 50% of the Ethereum network, or the ETH2 network, back in the day, because Bison Trails was powering Kraken and Ledger and a whole bunch of other, you know, exchanges that were all doing an ETH2 beacon chain staking product at the time. This was before there was any actual economic transactions of value on the beacon chain, so running 50% of the network now would be bad. Back then, it was sort of like, we'll decentralize eventually, which, you know, is to be fair, what happened.
There is a way to start, and that was, I mean, the easiest one at this stage.
Totally. And, you know, it was funny because I was like, well, the thing that made Ethereum so powerful back in the day was one global state machine, right? It was the fact that every transaction exists in the global state. And this is when Ethereum's scaling roadmap was sharding. They were going to start with 56 or 52 shards, which are basically parallel copies of the blockchain. And there'd be this 20-minute sync up that would happen. And, you know, my basic question was like, well, what about liquidity? What about fragmentation? Or is there going to be like a Uniswap shard and then there's going to be like an Aave shard? Or are we going to get all the DeFi on one shard because you want composability for DeFi? It was very unclear to me how these things would actually work. And at the time, I was like, I'm clearly missing something. Like, I must be wrong here. I've only been working in blockchain for like 2 years. Like, I'm not an engineer. I must be missing something here on the thesis. Turns out I wasn't missing something on the thesis. Everyone was just glossing over the composability issue with sharding. And we see this today with L2s, right? L2s are not atomically composable between each other. They're not atomically composable back to the L1. You basically have segregated execution environments. And so I was talking with a bunch of different L1s and some L2s at the time, as well as some data infrastructure projects. And the thing kept coming back to me was, so how are these things actually going to interoperate? How are we going to have smart contracts on different parachains or on different L2s or on different shards talk to each other? Or is the idea here that we're basically doing what Cosmos has been doing, but now in the Ethereum landscape, we're in the sort of alt L1 landscape? And, I kept sort of picking at this because I thought I was missing something about like people like, oh, well, you can use bridges and messaging. And that all felt very tenuous to me, honestly, especially back in the day when there really were no bridges and there was no messaging bridge buses. This is before Wormhole.
Even now, the experience is not that great. I mean, it's improving, but it's far from like being perfect.
100%. The best example of this today is how Pyth uses Wormhole to, import price feeds to a bunch of different chains for oracles. But like that's still a bunch of that happens off chain still. And so I got reached out to by Ben Sparango, who I had hired back at Republic, and then he left for a better job like 3 weeks later. But he was like, hey, we're trying to hire someone for this sort of role that's like it's part marketing, it's part product, it's part comm, it's part chief of staff at Solana Labs. Like, come interview. And I was like, I don't know, man. Like, I worked with 30 different protocols. When I was at Bison Trails, we technically supported Solana, but like we didn't work with anyone from Solana. Like, this was when Solana was a really unknown network. And he was like, just trust me, get on the phone with these guys. And I got on a call with Raj and Toli, and I was, they're like, what have you been doing? And I was talking about all the ETH2 work I've been doing. And I was like, but so here's like the thing. I don't understand how this works. Like, what am I missing here? No one can tell me what I'm missing. And Toli's like, oh, you're not missing anything. This is entirely the thing Solana's built to solve. Solana's built in one global state machine with full atomic composability between all transaction types, except it can do 50,000 transactions per second. And I was like, tell me more. And 30 hours later, we had a signed offer letter, right? And, the rest is history. So that was kind of how I really got involved in Solana back in the early days. This was not a moment where I sort of looked at Solana and was like, oh, this is going to be a top 4 network someday. This was where I looked around and I said, I think everyone else is missing something. And at the very least, I'm going to learn a ton working at Solana Labs here. And, it turned out that Toli's thesis was largely correct. And, it has made Solana the powerhouse that it is today. And, that's the long and the short of how I got here.
And so maybe can you explain like Solana to the people watching us in like very simple words, like in your own words?
Yeah.
And present also the pros and cons in a way to be very honest about it. Because you mentioned that it has like a lot of pros when it comes to liquidity and being able to build everything on the layer 1 and everything. But I guess it also gets some cons at the time. So. Cette vidéo vous est présentée en partenariat avec dYdX. dYdX est la solution décentralisée qui vous permet de trader les principales crypto-monnaies de manière liquide sur mobile et ordinateur. Contrairement à la majorité des exchanges, vous n'avez pas besoin de vous KYC et vous récupérez la majorité des frais que vous payez. Plus de 60 000 personnes utilisent déjà dYdX et j'en fais partie. Alors qu'attendez-vous? Scannez le QR code sur votre écran ou utilisez le lien dans la description pour créer votre compte avec un simple wallet et profitez de 5% de réduction sur vos frais. Allez, on repart sur l'interview.
Yeah, all architecture systems, whether it's blockchain or economic or physical architecture, they're all about trade-offs. And the great thing about software is you're selecting what trade-offs you want depending on what you're trying to build, right? And so Solana is a layer 1 blockchain, which means it's the base layer that everything runs on top of. And it operates, again, in one global state. So what does one global state mean? That's a nice term, but functionally what it means is anything on the network can establish verifiable trust with anything else on the network. So, the classic example of this is if I have my money in one bank, I can't go to a second bank and say, hey, can I get a loan? They'll be like, no, either move your money here or go get a loan from the other bank, because those banks are not composable between itself. There's no way for one bank to sort of establish trust that your funds are actually there and also be able to sort of say, and if you don't pay the loan, we're going to take those funds away, right? That is what composability and that is what one global state brings to folks. Now, the unique piece about Solana is it's a high throughput blockchain that is also operating in one single state. And that's made possible by a few advancements that other blockchains don't have. The first is parallelization. Ethereum can do one thing at a time. Everything is in order. So one transaction has to happen, it has to end, then the next transaction begins. Solana can do many things at the same time. And so that means that if there are two transactions that are not overlapping, if I'm paying you back for lunch and someone else is buying an NFT, those transactions can happen in parallel with one another, which is the way most things in other types of computer science work nowadays. And that means that you can actually have a lot more capacity because you don't have to wait for everything to finish and go in order. And that's one of those major differentiators for Solana compared to other networks. Now, the downsides of a really high performant network is that it takes more bandwidth, right? So you need, probably about 400 megabits per second of upload and download to stay up to date with the tip of the chain of Solana. That's more bandwidth than is required to run a Bitcoin node. That's more bandwidth than is required to run an Ethereum node. But that is just a truth of any high performance systems. You're always going to need more bandwidth to handle more transaction capacity. And so that means the cost of running something like a Solana node can be several $100s a month. And that's kind of one of those major differentiators between Solana and, say, running, an Ethereum node or something along those lines. Now, I think if you look at the system specs compared to layer 2s or rollups out there, Solana is just on par with what those systems are. So all blockchain nodes are getting heavier and more resource intensive to run as these systems get more mass adoption. They get more people building on them as well.
So in your opinion, like the problem that Solana has, like from a hardware perspective, is also a problem that other layer 1s or layer 2s will get like in the future in any way?
I don't know if all of them, and the reason I would say all of them is Ethereum has sort of shown they don't really want to scale the base layer, and Bitcoin again also does not want to scale the base layer. So if you're not looking at scaling the base layer of the blockchain, the hardware requirements may not increase. But if we want 10 million people, 100 million people per day transacting on blockchain, you're going to need more transaction capacity. So that means that the layer 2s and the layer 3s are also going to be heavier. And we see this with new networks as well, right? New networks at launch have significantly higher hardware requirements than Ethereum or Bitcoin did. And that's just a professionalization of the industry too. I think there's a real argument that what we want are people who are invested in the success of a network to be the ones actually running the nodes. And you don't necessarily... You need anyone to have the ability to run a node. It has to be permissionless. It has to be decentralized. It has to be all these sorts of things. But it doesn't mean that everyone has to necessarily run one at home, the same way that not everyone has to run a web server from their house or an email server. Now you can,
which
right?
is not the case like most of the time. Like I'm not having like a server to run like the website of my media, for example.
Totally. But in a situation where, let's just say, France has gone through some more intense censorship, let's say, than other countries, right? Maybe it is important for you for some, at some ability in the future, you could run your business on a web server running out of your house, right? And that is technically possible on the internet because the internet is fairly decentralized and fairly permissionless nowadays, which is great. But these are just things to kind of think about as we think about what is sort of the point of these networks. Does everyone need to run a node at their house? The answer is probably not, but you also need everyone to theoretically be able to. And so this is kind of what Solana's approach is. It's a very practical blockchain. The real ethos of the network is to build something that is high performance, that is really usable, that's scalable, that's dependable for businesses, but also is in keeping with the values that blockchain holds dear.
Like, is Solana trying to be more decentralized in any ways, or is it fine with like the current status of decentralization on Solana? Like, are you trying to be as decentralized as Ethereum, for example, or is it not the case? Because so far, I think one of the biggest complaints we've seen from like people that are skeptical about Solana is that it is a VC chain. Everything runs like on a couple of nodes and handled by like a few people. FTX could like click on a button and turn it off. This is what they are saying. I'm not saying that, to be honest. But what are your thoughts on this? And yeah, how do you think about it?
Yeah, so I will say a lot of that is just like not factually accurate. And so Solana has about half as many nodes as Ethereum does. So we're not caught up to Ethereum by any means. There's about 7,000 Ethereum nodes out there. If you go to nodewatch.io, it shows you how many Ethereum nodes there actually are. There's about half as many Solana nodes out there. So I think we're pretty good for, a tenth of the market cap of Ethereum to have half as decentralized. Like that's not bad.
Which is pretty young also.
This is the network's younger
important
too.
To mention. Yeah.
There's also, there's one area that Ethereum is quite further ahead, which is the number of validator clients. So in Ethereum, there are about 6 different validator clients that exist that run on, several different code bases. Solana today has 2 different validator clients that are based on the same code base, which is the Jito Labs client and the Solana Labs client. But a major initiative for the network is actually the creation of a wholesale new validator client called Firedancer. This is written in a new programming language from the ground up to be a separate implementation of the Solana network spec. And so those are some of the main decentralization initiatives that the Solana Foundation has been supporting, is the creation of multiple validator clients. And so that's kind of a major step forwards in the decentralization of the network. So it's kind of one of those things where it's a little bit of a Rorschach test. Like if you think Ethereum today is sufficiently decentralized, you should be pretty comfortable with Solana. If you don't think Ethereum is sufficiently decentralized, then you're not going to think Solana is sufficiently decentralized either. My personal opinion is if we actually want, 10% of the global economy to run on blockchain, we probably need to an order of magnitude more nodes on all blockchain networks than we have today. But that's also that's a very high goal, and I have no doubt that if we actually get to that
long-term goal.
Yeah, like the economic incentives alone would support that many nodes if blockchain adoption actually reaches anywhere near, 10% of the global financial system. So a lot of these problems are just problems of economic incentive. And so as more people use blockchain, the economic incentives will likely support more businesses running nodes.
You mentioned Firedancer, which is something I'm monitoring and watching for like a couple of weeks, month now. I got more interest into Firedancer since last Solana breakpoints. And in my opinion, this is one of the biggest narrative we will see like on Solana, or at least something that will hype people about Solana. Do you share my thoughts on this? And what, in your opinion, would be the change with like the situation before Firedancer and after? What will it change in your opinion?
Yeah, so Firedancer is anywhere between 10 to 100 times more performant than the Solana Labs client today. Now, this doesn't mean that we're going to go from a steady state of 4,000 transactions to 400,000 transactions per second on Solana. There's a lot of other things in the real world that will dictate how fast the network is actually able to run. But at the very least, this will mean that the Solana network is faster and cheaper to run, right? The team building Firedancer are getting these performance metrics using the exact same hardware people are using today to run Solana validators.
So this is quite realistic. This is what you're saying.
Yeah, it is. The biggest limiting factor will be bandwidth, right? And so this is one of those things where it's not, one of the great things about hardware is it gets faster every year. And we don't have to do anything to make that happen. Intel and NVIDIA and AMD and TSMC, they're putting hundreds of billions of dollars a year into R&D to make chips faster and faster and faster. And so, we get to piggyback on all of that great work that they're doing just by having the nature of Solana be something where hardware performance is a main driver of the network performance. And so, from my perspective, one of the great things about Firedancer is it's squeezing more performance out of the same hardware. And so that's a really good sign for, either reducing the cost to run a validator or massively increasing the capacity and throughput of the network. I do think, though, there's actually one potentially more impactful system coming to Solana in 2024, which are token extensions. And so token
What is it?
extensions are the original name of token extensions was the Token 2022 project. This is a new token program with a whole new set of token standards coming to the network. It's on testnet now, and it's rolling out on mainnet in January. But this brings a whole series of optionality and system improvements that businesses and users can use to build entirely new types of token experiences on Solana. So one of the pieces that token extension supports are confidential transfers, which uses zero-knowledge systems to say, if you and I are transacting, someone can see that we transacted, and they may be able to see that the currency we transacted in was USDC, but they're not going to be able to see the actual amount of tokens that were transferred back and forth. So that's really useful for a lot of different applications, but some of the coolest things are actually frameworks that are really important for compliance. So there's the ability in Token 2022 to do things like install transfer hooks, which means that the transferability of a token is governed by a program deployed on the Solana network. Now, that program could do any sort of thing. It could say, you can't buy this NFT if your wallet has only been created in the last 7 days. It could say, hey, you are only allowed to interact with this token if you have this other NFT in your wallet, right? There's all sorts of different rules that someone designing a token could build to really manage how that token works and performs, in the world. These are really important components for things like stablecoin issuers that need to be able to comply with sanctions law. They need to be able to, potentially in the EU with MiCA coming out, have KYC requirements on all users that hold that stablecoin. But the nice thing about this is it doesn't actually require a fully centralized management system for allowing token transfers and movements, right? And so this is really a whole tool set that's designed to meet the needs of businesses trying to bring real-world assets on chain, whether that's tokenized funds, tokenized farmland, carbon credits, treasuries, stable coins, whatever it might be.
So yeah, this is quite interesting because this is something I heard about a few weeks ago at least, but it didn't get really a deep attention from me. You mentioned some of the use cases. In your opinion, what would be the biggest use cases for token extension? What, or at least what excites you the most when it comes to token extension in terms of use cases?
So today you hear more and more about this idea of permissioned environments. And so a permissioned environment is, the idea of we need a private version of, a subnet of a specific type of network. And we're going to be able to trade certain types of securities, like true, real securities on that network because it's permissioned and we can KYC every user. And that's kind of the thing you hear today. But if you have to go into Phantom and you have to change your network from Solana to JP Morgan Exchange, right? Or go into MetaMask and change it. No one's going to do that. The whole experience is going to be clunky. You're going to fragment liquidity. And so one of the really powerful things about token extensions is it lets people build basically a permissioned environment on the Solana mainnet. And so that means that you can go to Jupiter Aggregator, you can go to Mango Markets, you can go to MarginFi, you can go to all of these DeFi marketplaces that folks know and love, and you'll be able to actually interact with permissioned tokens if your wallet is approved to interact with them. So if there's a company that's, let's say, there's a an apartment building in Paris, and it's been bought by this company, and they're tokenizing it, right? They're fractionalizing the ownership out. There may be a requirement that says, hey, you need to go through KYC with us to prove that you're a French citizen and that, you meet certain income requirements. And I'm not sure exactly what the securities laws are in France. But if someone does that, but if someone does that, they may be now allowed to actually buy and sell and trade their fractional shares of an apartment building fully on chain. And they don't have to go to some custom application on some custom network to be able to do this. They can do it right alongside, trading dog money and other meme coins and all those sorts of things. And so I think that's actually a really big unlock because the last thing people want is sort of to be carved out into one little side of Solana or another network and say, okay, like you can trade, but only here, right? There's a lot of applications for game developers as well to say something like, hey, you can actually only buy items in our game if you're actually a player, right? You have to play at least, 2 hours a week in order to be able to buy and trade items. Because what we don't want is we don't want a bunch of, basically private equity guys coming in and buying all the rare items and then selling them
Not
back
sure
to
if it
real
will
players.
change, but at least that would be possible.
Yeah, right. I mean, like, yeah, again, who knows if the games are going to want to do that, but it would allow these sorts of things to be possible. It would also allow a user to say something like, hey, I really want to swap my, threshold Bitcoin for Sol, but I want to make sure that the people I'm transacting with are all known. Now, this is not something you actually hear that often from hardcore crypto folks. But, with more of the conversation around illicit finance, you could see someone saying, hey, I know that like illicit finance on crypto is not that big of a problem, but I really want to make sure that when I'm doing trades on chain, I'm not interacting with anyone who's in North Korea. I'm not interacting with anyone who, is involved in any sort of illicit finance. So I only want to trade with people who have voluntarily gone through KYC, right?
Okay.
So that's now a pool that anyone can permissionlessly create. And so this is really one of the cool things about token extensions. It's not just about giving developers and issuers more power and more control over how they build tokens. It's about giving users more optionality to say something like, hey, I know I technically can trade with anyone, but I want to make sure I'm only trading with people who are in the United States and have gone through some form of KYC. And that's up to the user, right? Right now, you're sort of forced into a take it or leave it, all blockchains permissionless, all DeFi is permissionless. But, maybe as a user, you're a politician, you're a public figure, you're Ryan Reynolds, right? And, you want to make sure that you're not accidentally transacting with a nefarious actor.
Understood. And like, is it something possible like on other blockchains, or is it like the first like public way to do it? Did you get some inspirations in any way, like for this kind of developments?
So on a lot of other blockchains, components of this exist, but they are built by multiple independent companies that you sort of have to assemble your entire system yourself. And because it involves
it's not by default, basically.
Yeah, this is basically the argument going through on Ethereum right now about enshrinement, right? Is basically like Ethereum has no native delegation, right? On Solana, I can say, hey, I'm going to take my tokens and I'm going to delegate them to this validator, and then I'm going to get rewards for that delegation. Most blockchains have that feature. Ethereum doesn't. On Ethereum, you're trusting the Lido smart contract or the Alluvial Finance smart contract or some liquid staking provider's smart contract. And so the advantage of having all of this packaged up into one token program is that wallets, infrastructure, dApps, DeFi, all of the things on Solana are going to support it by default because it's all wrapped up in one cohesive token program. And so that's what we think is a really big advantage for both developers and users, is that they don't need to worry about, oh, is this, something that's going to be supported in Phantom and Soulflare and all these wallets, because it will be under this one token program design. You'll basically get full compatibility on day one, or at least within a few months of the token program launching, which is something that doesn't exist on other blockchains today.
So when it comes to Solana, I think one of the biggest arguments is that it is fast, but also that it is cheap in terms of like fees and everything. How can you explain that those fees are so low? Can you explain it technically? Because I think a lot of people might not understand like why fees are so low and will stay low in a way. And maybe if there are like any developments or like any, I would say changes coming in the future when it comes to fees.
Yeah, so part of the reason transaction fees are so low on Solana is they're very abundant, right? There's, a steady state of, roughly 4,000 transactions per second. And so what we see is that the average fee is quite low because the fee doesn't have to be very large, right? Which I know is sort of a tautology, but like if there were no one using Ethereum, Ethereum's fees would also be very, very low. The difference is, Ethereum can do about 14 things per second. Solana can do thousands of things per second. So that's one mechanism for why the fees are lower on Solana. Another is just that the value accrual long term comes from things like priority fees and stake weighted QoS. So validators can afford to process transactions at very, very low transaction fees because it's not their only source of revenue that comes in. And so this is where local fee markets play a really big role in the long-term economic design of Solana, which is when there's contestation for a piece of state. So maybe there's a really hot NFT mint. There's hundreds of thousands of people trying to mint an NFT, but there's only 10,000 available. There will be competition for whose transaction lands first. And one of the main ways that competition is expressed are through fees. And so these fees will spike for that specific smart contract. But as the fees spike to, maybe the astronomically high cost of 25 cents on Solana, that won't impact the cost of doing a Solana Pay transaction or of doing a token swap in a DeFi marketplace because the network is parallel. And so because the network is parallel, fee competition in one area that might spike fees here will have no impact on fees on another part
from
of the network.
others, yes. Because that was the main issue. Like, for example, I participated to the sale of Overdeed and Overside, and basically I paid like 1 ETH fee at this time, which is kind of crazy, I can say.
It makes banks look reputable.
So yeah, I think that is like a big pro for Solana, and I think, like, personally, whenever I use Solana, the thing is that I almost don't pay fees, and that makes a big difference in this kind of bull market environment, or at least growth environment, because because whenever I want to swap something on ETH now, it costs me like $60, $70. So
exactly, right? I mean, there are people who in the early, like in the 2021 days were spending, or 2022, were spending $3,200 in gas to claim their ApeCoin airdrop, which is just an insane fee, right? Yeah. And yes, you can argue that like maybe they got enough economic value out of claiming the token airdrop that was a reasonable amount of money to spend, but there's no reason really at the end of the day that they should have had to do that, right? And even if you are an Ethereum maxi and you think everything should be on the ETH L1 at the end of the day, they could have done the airdrop on Solana and then just allowed people to bridge their tokens over at their leisure to Ethereum, right? This is the idea that Solana is actually at its core an execution layer chain, and it doesn't require Bitcoin to fail. It doesn't require Ethereum to fail for Solana to be successful, because I think if you're a Bitcoin maxi, you should be trading Bitcoin on Solana because it's the cheapest, fastest, most decentralized place to do that. If you want to have all of your long-term economic wealth in Ether on Ethereum, great. I'm not going to argue with you on that. You should be buying it on Solana, right? If you're dollar cost averaging in, and then when you have, large amounts of ETH you want to move back over the bridge, do that. But there's no reason to spend $20 every time you want to buy Ether.
I mean, you add a risk having like your collateral like bridged in a way. So I can understand people don't want to have like a ETH on Solana in a way. I mean, sure, it adds risk at the end.
Yeah, but so the argument here is that the proportional risk is much, much, much lower than the amount of money you're spending on gas fees. So if what you're doing is you're buying $200 of Ethereum every week, every Tuesday at 4 p.m. or whatever your dollar cost averaging strategy is, do that on Solana. You'll save a ton in fees, and then you can transfer over once a quarter or something like that, and you only pay that Ethereum gas fee once to bridge over. So this is why the execution layer vision of Solana is quite interesting and compelling. Is that we're not necessarily like a maxi chain in that regard. If the core asset you want is something else, power to you. Solana is built to be a high-performant, low-fee environment for trading, social, decentralized physical infrastructure networks, NFTs. You know, pick your use case. But it's generally fast and cheap on Solana.
Lately, we've seen the airdrop narrative like grow a lot on Solana, especially because of the Jito airdrop. How do you perceive it? Because like at the end of the day, it really helps like getting like Solana adopted, but also you have like a lot of mercenaries just coming to extract a lot of value, and we're not sure it will stay. So what are your thoughts on what's going on Solana now in terms of narratives and airdrops and everything?
Yeah, you know, it's funny because when it happens on Solana, people are mercenary, and when it happens on Ethereum, it's just value accrual, right? So there's a little bit of hypocrisy in some of those criticisms. Like we all remember Friend Tech, right? But like I think at its core, what you're seeing are very serious technology products and user experience products being built on Solana, launching airdrops. So, you know, Jito has built incredible core technology, right? They have built the MEV client for Solana. They also run a really powerful liquid staking operation with Jito Sol, and they have this whole incredible StakeNet product that they've just launched too. So if you think about it from that perspective, Flashbots plus Lido plus the graph is actually a pretty compelling product vision for why something on Solana would actually be economically valuable. And I think it's really important to note that these are not just accidental. You can build more on chain on Solana than you can on other networks because the transactions are low, because the transactions are abundant, because you can predict long term into the future that transactions are going to continue to remain, cost effective to process. You can build much more on chain. In other ecosystems, we're seeing a trend where people are moving the order books off chain. They're moving the matching engines off chain. They're saying, we actually don't need everything on blockchain. We only need settlement on blockchain. Everything else can be done through a centralized matching engine. I don't know what we're doing, right? Like genuinely, I that feels to me like a betrayal of the values that got me into this space. And so what I really love about projects building on Solana, and Jupiter is another great example of this, is that the whole thing is on chain. Jupiter is an aggregator for multiple liquidity pools and multiple swaps. So you can go and you want to trade some tokens on Jupiter. It's going to hit up maybe half a dozen different liquidity pools to get you the best price it can get you on chain. But you can also do limit orders on chain. You can also do DCA purchases on chain. It's got a power set of features that really resembles what a centralized exchange can deliver, except it's doing it all on chain in a permissionless, decentralized fashion. And so I think there's a little bit of an airdrop narrative around like, is the initial airdrop value these projects are launching at, like, is that defensible? Is I think a question I've sort of seen. Time will tell, but there's real core tech and real core innovation here that is not available on any other blockchain today. And I think that's meaningful and something worth watching when folks are evaluating airdrops in Solana.
And what we can say also is that they've been building like for a while and are just getting now their token. Like Jupiter exists for a while now, so I'm not very surprised of this happening like quite soon. So
right. And this is like Metaplex is a great example of this. Now, Metaplex,
the OGs.
Yeah, right. And look, Metaplex probably launched a token far too early, right? Hindsight's 2020 and all this stuff. But Metaplex has very small fees on NFT, minting and updating and a bunch of things like that. And that very small fee is bringing in millions of dollars of protocol revenue, right? And this is sort of the core thesis of Solana, is that the TAM is so much larger with cheap transactions and fast finality and high throughput that the economics of the network look very different at scale. I think if you're selling to 50 customers, the Oracle, IBM, $20 to $200 million software contract model makes a ton of sense. But you know what? Salesforce or in Slack with a SaaS model selling to 1,000 times more people at, 100,000 times more people at, 1,000 times cheaper at scale, that actually generates more revenue and more profit than Oracle ever could. And I think that's the right way to look at this, is that Solana is much more similar to SaaS or cloud providers in terms of what its economics look like than your typical, 1990s software contracting model.
Cette vidéo vous est présentée en partenariat avec dYdX. dYdX est LA solution décentralisée qui vous permet de trader les principales crypto-monnaies de manière liquide sur mobile et ordinateur. Contrairement à la majorité des exchanges, vous n'avez pas besoin de vous KYC et vous récupérez la majorité des frais que vous payez. Plus de 60 000 personnes utilisent déjà dYdX et j'en fais partie, alors qu'attendez-vous? Scannez le QR code sur votre écran ou utilisez le lien dans la description pour créer votre compte avec un simple wallet et profitez de 5% de réduction sur vos frais. Allez, on repart sur l'interview. I wanted to discuss a bit about like the hard periods Solana went through.
Yeah.
I think like in 2022, we've seen like the fall of FTX and Alameda, which were very invested in Solana. How was it to work and be part of the ecosystem like at this time on Solana? Because people were very skeptical. We've seen like guys from dGods and Utes and everything goes out from Solana and migrate to ETH and Polygon and everything, which is pretty funny now.
Yes.
How was it on your side, and what are your perspectives for the future since you have like all these bad events behind you, I guess?
Yeah, it was a rough time, I think especially when you look at November of 2022, right? This was, I think, people forget that FTX was probably considered to be the number 2 most stable exchange, right? It was Coinbase, and then it was FTX. And everyone was like, oh, I don't know if I trust X or Y or Z.
Especially
exchange.
in the US.
Yeah, especially in the US. But, this was someone that, an exchange that seemed to have the blessing of regulators, seemed to have the blessing of politicians, seemed to have the blessing of most of the crypto elite, right? And so the collapse of it, I think, hit the entire industry really, really hard. And, it always is the centralized things that fail, right? For Bitcoin, they had their Mt. Gox moment. It's always the centralized actors that fail. It's never actually the decentralized actors that fail. But it was, there was a really tough, probably 3 weeks there after the collapse of FTX where, there was a real sort of feeling of folks looking around, specifically like developers and founders on Solana, saying like, is everyone else still here? And the answer was yes.
Yeah.
There
I was surprised. I was very surprised of the reaction of like the Solana community, because you could expect people to just move away from Solana and say, okay, this shit is done. I don't want to use it anymore. But I've seen like especially the NFT community was very strong. And I think that the NFT community really kept Solana alive like through all those moments, and really also got like the biggest like adoption moments at the very beginning of Solana. So, but I was very, very surprised of this.
Yeah, well, part of this, I will say, is I'm trying to think here. I don't think there's any technical teams that left Solana, which is astonishing to be able to say. There's certainly some protocols that failed, right, as the market drew down, but I really can't think of any that said we're giving up on Solana and we're moving to another network. There's as you mentioned, dGods, and there's an NFT project or two that did that, but NFT projects aren't technical projects anyway. The underlying blockchain is much less important to their values than sort of where their community is, right? And so, but on a technical side, I think really what we saw is that you can't build the stuff people were building on Solana anywhere else. So there's a, let's call it 90% of the founders were like, look, I have high conviction this network is going to be able to get through this. They're going to stick around, like this will come back. Solana is not worse today than it was 2 weeks ago. In fact, you could argue it's actually better because one of the largest bad actors we've ever had in the industry has been burned out of the network, which was a painful experience. But coming out of this, the network, the community is incredibly strong. But even if they wanted to move, there's no network that rivals Solana's performance and characteristics that they were able to move to. I think if Solana had just been another EVM fork, you may have seen that real exodus event, but we didn't see that. Now, from the outside, let me say, I get it. Like,
Yeah.
if you were a VC, I understand why you didn't write any checks to Solana projects in the last year. There is almost no network that could have gone through what Solana went through and come out as strong as it's come out on this side. And that, there are, I know VCs that made the asymmetric bet. They bought a bunch of SOL at $8 and they had high conviction and they're doing great. But at the same time, I don't fault anyone as a user or an investor or a founder looking at it from the outside who said, I'm just gonna,
It's
I'm
okay
gonna
to
wait.
doubt.
It's like, I'm gonna wait. I'm just gonna let the dust settle a little bit because this is scary and I don't understand what's going on. And again, no fault to anyone for that. I think that was a very rational decision for folks who had not already been a part of the community and had not already seen how resilient and how powerful this network is.
So far, we mentioned like a lot of very technical things about Solana, also the bad things, or at least the bad environment that we've seen, and we went through like the last months, or at least last 12 months. Now it's getting better, at least in terms of adoption and in terms of developments, which is very exciting. And I wanted to have your insights on the ecosystem, like especially in terms of protocols and projects that you've seen building. Since you are talking with most of the builders in the ecosystem, I guess, what excites you the most? What are you the most excited about? In your personal views, I guess, because you cannot say that for Solana as a foundation or whatever. But
look, I will say,
as you want.
I mean, there's things I'm personally excited about because I find them to be really awesome projects. But what I'll say in broad strokes, what I really love is there's sort of this like inverse bell curve of stuff being built on Solana. There's a lot of folks doing very hardcore deep tech work, whether that's like the folks at like Elusive and Light doing zero knowledge systems on chain, Jito, those sorts of guys, or whether it's on the other side, which is like real user-friendly consumer-facing products like Helium Mobile, Jupiter Aggregator, right? There's a lot of this sort of focus on how do we build, Drip House is a great example of this. How do we build things for consumers? How do we build things that are, world-class product experiences that if you didn't know is built on blockchain, you wouldn't actually be able to tell it's built on blockchain. I think Sling falls into that category as well as a peer-to-peer money transmitter system. And, that is for me a real characteristic of a healthy network. If everyone is building infrastructure or everyone's trying to build, token projects that are consumer-facing and NFT projects, both of those are sort of a sign of an unhealthy system. You need a balance between folks who are working on the deep core, true enablement technology that might take 18 months to ship, but when it does, it'll have a massive impact. And the folks who are out there every day making a case to consumers about why they should use blockchain and showing them the power and promise of what can be possible when you build on a network like Solana. And so, I think like the best example of this is probably Helium. Right, Helium's a decentralized physical infrastructure network that runs, radios and 5G service and IoT connectivity services all over the world. And then, on top of that, and they're built on Solana. And then on top of that are projects like Baxis, which is a really interesting project that's doing tokenized whiskey as an asset class. And they use Helium as environmental sensor monitoring in all of their warehouses. And, all of these different little pieces of technology are enabling us to build entirely new types of product experiences that, again, like Baxis, if you just come into their website, you can buy a bottle of whiskey as an asset class with a credit card. And you kind of wouldn't know it's on blockchain unless you start digging in and looking at it. But it is, right? Blockchain is powering the thing under the hood. And so having those sort of dual class of builders on Solana is, I think, one of the coolest things for me about the network.
When it comes to people that I would say more integrating into the ecosystem, that are more active than the usual normie, getting some attention about Solana because like they have seen like the Jito airdrop lately.
Yeah.
What are the projects in your mind that are considered as underdogs that have like good tech, good app, good customer facing interface, and products, and that deserves maybe a bit more, in your opinion?
Man, I would say Solana DeFi in general deserves way more attention than it gets. Solana recently did, I think it was 95% of the volume of Ethereum dexes with 1/30th the TVL. So the capital efficiency of Solana DeFi is just unmatched. And that's really awesome to see, right? I think that deserves more celebration. That's starting to get more attention as well, which is good. What Credix is doing is really interesting too with credit market availability. I think there's a lot of projects that are working on real world assets, whether that's tokenized real estate or tokenized carbon credits, other sorts of bringing treasuries on chain. That work is sort of probably going to be like Q1, Q2 in 2024 and is really quite interesting as well. But I think what like Drip House is doing is like really noteworthy with them creating an entirely new paradigm for how NFTs can work, how artists can get paid on chain. And so for me, like that, the experimentation is the stuff that I think is really interesting. So when you say like what's not getting the attention it deserves, I would say many of the applications on Solana should be like a bat signal to developers and other ecosystems to say, oh, this is what you can actually build on chain nowadays. And like we need a whole new class of crypto applications across every network to attract the first billion users to blockchain. And I think Solana developers are pretty far ahead of the curve there, but this industry is better when it's competitive, right? I really am excited for the entire leveling up of the industry I think we're going to see over the next 2 years.
Thank you very much for your time. I have 2 more questions for you.
Sure.
The first one is like, I would like to maybe have more, I would say, personalities or builders that are building on Solana on my French-speaking show. Do you have any, I don't know, names in your mind that should come interact with the French-speaking ecosystem and maybe get an interview with him?
Yeah, I mean, on the developer perspective, John, one of our engineers, is based in France and fluent, so he may be a great person.
Interesting.
Yeah, look, I think the stuff Vibu is doing over at Drip House is very interesting. Armani also.
From
Armani
Backpack,
built
right?
Anchor and Backpack and Mad Lads, and Armani and Tristan have done quite a bunch of work on this stuff. Another person who may be interesting is Bartosz, who used to be one of the systems engineers at Solana Labs, and he's now actually building a new semi-decentralized exchange that has a whole MPC vault system behind it. So it's sort of hybrid custody where it's not centralized custody and it's not self-custody. It's sort of somewhere in between. But it means that there's the custody risk of an exchange no longer exists, but you still get some of the features of a centralized exchange. So it's called Cube. So they're a very interesting.
Yeah, I heard about
as
it.
Well.
Yeah, I heard about it. Some friends of mine like mentioned it lately. So
yeah, the other one I would say is
Scott
from the Helium Foundation. I think Helium is doing an incredible job. They have a bunch of node operators in France as well, so that could be a good one too.
Thank you very much for that. Maybe do you have any thoughts you would like to share for the people who have been watching this interview until the very end? Any last words on this?
Yeah, look, I would say consider getting involved in this industry, right? And that can take all shapes and forms. If you're watching this and you're at a large company and you feel like you're the only person who knows blockchain there, go try and form a little cohort within that company. I think most companies should have a skunkworks division or just a little experimental group that's figuring out, hey, like if blockchain 10x's in the next 2 years, does that change anything about our business? How could we use blockchain to shave 2 to 3% off of our operating costs, right? I mean, Credix is doing this in credit access markets in Latin America, and they're saving 50 to 75 basis points just by using blockchain technology for money transfers. At scale, that is a huge amount of savings, right? And so I think every company should be thinking about how blockchain could change or improve their business. And if you're that one person internally at Orange or something like that. Like go find more people.
Go for it.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Austin, for that. Thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure to have you. And yeah, see you soon.
Thanks.